Hey there guys, this is Richard, your host, with another marvelous video. Now that all the episodes of Season 1 of The Rings of Power are finally out there, it's a good time to evaluate how far the narrative has drifted from Tolkien's lore. The biggest budget web series got a lot of flack for introducing new characters and reimagining some of the familiar ones. But to be fair, the showrunners didn't have rights to some of Tolkien's greatest works. They based much of their narrative on their interpretation of the Silmarillion and brought in their innovation for several key aspects. Keeping all debates aside, let's take a closer look at some of the notable differences between Tolkien's lore and some of the major events and characters in The Rings of Power. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Sauron's origin story drifts from the original Lord of the Rings canon. When the season finale revealed that Halbrand was Sauron all along, many of the viewers simply had their guesses confirmed. A lot of the hints were already starting to add up, and it would have been a surprise if things actually went in another direction. However, the portrayal of Sauron has not exactly been the way that the fans of Tolkien's lore were expecting. The creators have revealed that a lot of work has gone into reading between the lines from the Silmarillion and Tolkien's letters. They pondered over capturing the kind of character Sauron actually was after he was battered and bruised at the end of the First Age. So, was he actually repenting his past actions and seeking redemption? Or was it all an act to gain the confidence of someone like Galadriel? Well, Tolkien was not specific about the events in Sauron's life during the Second Age, and he simply mentions that Sauron lingers around before making a comeback. Halbrand's entire story arc is a creative liberty taken by the makers, and everything that he does from meeting Galadriel, journeying to Numenor, and then finally revealing his identity are things that the fans are not familiar with. There are also some similarities as well, such as the fact that Sauron actually manipulates the elves to forge the Rings of Power. That being said, we expected more drama between Brimbor and Sauron, which would have been a closer adaptation of the original text. According to Tolkien's lore, Sauron uses the disguise of an elf named Anatar to confuse Brimbor and gain his confidence. The Rings of Power doesn't even mention Anatar once, and it's safe to assume that they decided to skip over this part altogether. This brings us to our next point of difference, the portrayal of Brimbor.
I've had many names.
Did the Rings of Power change Galadriel a bit too much? It was established pretty early that Galadriel would be one of the leading protagonists of the show, and this was another character that those well-versed with the books and previous movies were eager to watch out for. As with some of the other major characters, Galadriel in the show is a pale shadow of the Galadriel that Tolkien had introduced. For one, she is a lot younger in the show, given that the timeline is thousands of years before the events of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Her age is reflected in her temperament, which shows signs of arrogance, impatience, and immaturity. She is yet to be the Lady of Lothlorien, and nowhere in Tolkien's works is she mentioned as the commander of northern armies. While the Amazon series added a lot to her character, it must also be considered that Tolkien left a lot about Galadriel open to interpretation. Her personality or mannerisms are not as detailed as some others like Frodo or Gandalf, and while Tolkien did write lots of details about her actions, the timeline remained shadowy. Finally, in the season finale, we see her talk about her husband. Things are certainly not in sync with the original timeline in this regard, because she indicates that Celeborn is dead. How did we see him in the Fellowship of the Ring in that case? The only saving grace might be if Galadriel is unaware of her husband escaping from the lethal attack on Beleriand, which is called Lindon in the show. In Tolkien's works, Galadriel and Celeborn are separated, but he never goes missing, and we can't help but wonder if such a change was even necessary.
What has happened?
The Mithril is proud.
Brimbor in Tolkien's world is very different from what you see in the Rings of Power. Brimbor is one character whose lore in Tolkien's work is as extensive and important as any other. Hence, fans were eager to find out how Brimbor would be presented in the Rings of Power, and as expected, there are some glaring differences. Going by Tolkien's story, Brimbor was born in the First Age, and he was the son of an elven king. He fought alongside the elves against the forces of Morgoth, and in the Second Age he settled down in Eregion as one of the rulers. He was crucial to forge the budding relationship between elves and the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, and this is when he focused more on his craftsmanship. In the Rings of Power, Brimbor is shown being manipulated by Sauron in disguise, and while it's not Anatar, the great craftsman still falls for Sauron's tricks and flattery. He's the creator of the 3 elven rings, Vilyar, Ninyar, and Narya, just like he did in the books, but he also helps in forging several lesser rings in Tolkien's works. Eventually, he tried to hide the power rings from Sauron, who wasn't too pleased with Brimbor. He was executed after being captured by Sauron, and he had a gruesome end where Sauron tied his corpse to a pole and used it as his flag. We're yet to know if the Rings of Power will have a similar climax in store for Brimbor, but his screen presence so far certainly doesn't sync with the personality the fans are familiar with. For instance, when he sends Elrond to befriend the elves in the series, many question the need to do that when he's said to have had a strong relationship with the dwarves himself. Durin, the dwarf, only trusts Elrond, and Brimbor is treated more as an outsider, which is directly against what Tolkien had visioned. In fact, the creator of this fantasy universe never wrote anything about Elrond and Durin being close friends, which became one of the major plot points. Lastly, Mithril, the special metal, is not a dwarven name, and in the books, the dwarves guard this secret closely. Tolkien never wrote about Mithril being the source that could preserve the light of the Valar and protect the elves, and the whole origin story of Mithril is created just for the Rings of Power. Clearly, the showrunners want to create something new in this regard because the storylines of characters like Durin and Brimbor do not match with their story arcs from the books. The whole Southlands Saga. Did Tir Harad exist in Tolkien's work? The village of Tir Harad is one of the first human settlements that we get to see in the Rings of Power. The village is said to be comprising of those men whose ancestors fought for Morgoth, and now the elves continue to keep watch over the village to make sure that the corruption in their hearts does not erupt again. Tolkien never created any such village, and everything from the characters to the whole premise of Tir Harad is an innovation from the showrunners. Tolkien only wrote about men living in the Southlands and how Shelob the monster would prey on men and elves from the land before Sauron claimed the region as Mordor. There is a shout out to the Southlands in the show, and even the entire fake identity of Halbrand rests on him being the last surviving ruler of the Southlands. Toward the later episodes, it becomes clear that the people of Tir Harad are a part of the Southlands, and it's also evident that some of the characters will enjoy a long run in the seasons to come. The ruler of Numenor has a different fate in the books. One of the grandest sights in the show, and certainly one of the most visually stunning moments, was when we were greeted by the land of Numenor. Galadriel and Halbrand are brought in after being found in the sea, and the queen, Miriel, is not exactly thrilled at the sight of an elf. The story suggests that Numenor stopped welcoming elves for a long time now, and the previous king, Miriel's father, is exiled because of his attraction for the elves, which the people of the land detested. Galadriel is annoyed at the lack of gratitude from the people of Numenor because she believes that all their development and flourishing economy are the results of blessings of the elves after they fought together against Morgoth. In this entire portrayal, one of the major things that go against Tolkien's lore is Miriel as the queen of Numenor. The showrunners tried to stay close to his overall position on Numenor, but Tolkien wrote about Ar-Pharazôn seizing the throne for himself instead of the rightful heir Miriel after her father's death. In the final episode, we actually see the king passing away, but there has been no indication of Ar-Pharazôn staging a coup. In fact, he has been a loyal advisor to the queen so far, and his people skills have come in handy when the commoners were antagonized by the presence of an elf in their land. However, there is still time, and he did have the public support to oust the queen if he desired, which means that if such an event takes place in the second season, you shouldn't be too surprised, especially now that the queen is blinded by the eruption of Mount Doom. The weakness of the leader might be the perfect reason for him to step in. Oh, and just so you know, Miriel's blindness was also not Tolkien's idea.
Keep your voice down.
I didn't realize you're in the middle of something important.
Pharazôn's son, Kemen, should not exist. This one is a glaring difference from Tolkien's lore because his works clearly mention that Pharazôn never had a child. While his storyline of Pharazôn seizing the throne from Miriel might still be a possibility, the introduction of his Kemen in the show cannot be undone. As Tolkien's narrative suggests, Pharazôn takes over the rule of Numenor and forces Queen Miriel to marry him. But the forced marriage does not change her feelings for him, and he never has an offspring to become his heir. In fact, he happens to be the last king of Numenor, and Kemen's entire existence goes against the Tolkien perspective. In the show, Kemen is shown to have feelings for Captain Elendil's daughter Arianne, which is also a new character that Tolkien never wrote about. Thus, many are assuming that the chances are high that such characters will be killed off without delving too much into their individual story arcs. We'll have to wait and watch to find out what actually happens. A reshuffled timeline changes the course of some major events. Whether you like the show or not, you have to admit that the creators did some serious tampering with the original timeline of the lore. They did so for characters and also for some of the major events that are shown in the series. For instance, the forging of the Rings of Power is taking place a lot before it actually should, just to sync up with Miriel's reign. The mortal and immortal characters in the show exist in this timeline together, and it often becomes confusing for those who know just how old some characters are supposed to be. Even the rise and fall of Numenor have been condensed significantly, and the timeline around these events is not detailed.
One object for all Middle-earth.
High King Gil-galad is not supposed to be a scheming politician. By now, it's pretty obvious that the showrunners have messed with the timeline of the Second Age quite a bit to suit their demands. They have twisted the storyline of some crucial characters, but the presentation of Gil-galad did not go down well with most of the fans. This is because the show largely portrays him as a scheming politician who is extremely protective of his own clan and ready to sacrifice his allies for the cause. He is suspicious of Elrond's true intentions, and the finale actually shows him denouncing his son Durin for disobeying his orders. In Tolkien's lore, the High King of the Elves is a brave warrior who fights Sauron alongside Elendil. His tales of bravery seem to be a far cry from where we're headed with his character, and maybe this is one change that the showrunners could have refrained from making. Adar and Sauron's rivalry. Firstly, the introduction of a new character named Adar, who was a father figure and leader of the Orcs, was quite a surprising addition. Many were even speculating the possibility of Adar being Sauron, but the season finale has revealed otherwise. It is revealed in the show that Adar was serving Sauron before he was disgusted with the constant experiments and sacrifices of his children, the Orcs. After his capture by Galadriel, Adar admits during interrogation that he was not a follower of Sauron any longer, and on the contrary, he was the one who put an end to the Dark Lord. After splitting Sauron open, Adar left with the Orcs to fulfill his grand plan in the Southlands. While this storyline helps us understand why Halbrand had to run away and try to save himself, it certainly opens up a whole new arena that Tolkien never wrote about. Obviously, since he never mentioned a character named Adar, he also did not talk about Sauron's rift with such a character. Adar probably believes Sauron is dead, although there is also a possibility that he recognized Halbrand to be the Dark Lord. Whatever be the case, it would be quite intriguing to see the fate of their rivalry in the upcoming season. The controversial origins, the Orcs. The origin of the Orcs in the Lord of the Rings universe is a heavily debated topic, mainly because even Tolkien changed the origin story. He first spoke about Morgoth being the creator of Orcs using his evil magic, but later he changed the narrative and mentioned how the supreme being Eru Ilúvatar was the only one who could create life. Morgoth was displeased and jealous about his inability, and he used one of the Supreme Being's creations to develop Orcs. The Rings of Power largely follows the latter idea, and that also explains the origin of Adar. The interrogation scene between Galadriel and Adar sheds some light on this when Adar reveals his backstory. We learn about him being one of the earliest elves, captured and tortured by Morgoth to be transformed into a twisted life form. He mentions how he prefers the term Uruk to describe himself, and it becomes clear that he is literally the father of all Orcs. It seems that the Orcs continue to grow more disfigured and twisted as they move further from their elf ancestors, and the only reason Adar looks so different is because he has existed for thousands of years. This is one aspect where the showrunners had to introduce fresh ideas and make changes, and as long as they keep up with all the build-up, we aren't complaining. Tolkien never wrote about wargs in the Second Age. Let's take you back to the scene where the elf soldier Arondir is imprisoned as a slave laborer by the Orcs. When he and his fellow elf prisoners attempt a daring escape attempt, the plan almost ends up working. They try to use the sun to prevent the Orcs from going after them, but the Orcs unleash a familiar beast for the Tolkien fans. Even those who watch The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit will know about the warg, but the real question is, did wargs exist in the Second Age? If you strictly go by Tolkien's writing, the man never wrote about wargs being present in the Second. You could argue that there was not enough detailed storytelling focused on the Second Age, but even then, to see wargs in the Rings of Power came as a surprise. The showrunners make the warg look very different from the previous versions, probably because of the rights issue, but there is no doubting the fact that it is the same creature. Tolkien actually wrote about wargs being corrupted by Sauron's evil, which made the beastly creatures fight for him. He didn't specify the timeline of this event, and hence, it could be possible that the corruption had already taken place. It adds to the opinion that Halbrand as Sauron is not as innocent and repentant as he tries to portray. Maybe what we see in the show are the early forms of wargs, which go on to become a lot larger and terrifying with time.
Palantir.
The abilities of Palantiri were stretched a bit too far in the show. The Palantiri, or the Seeing Stones of Middle-earth, were wondrous instruments of magic with great powers. Tolkien wrote about how the Palantiri could be used to observe events in space and time, and how it could also be used to communicate with others over great distances. All the major Palantiri had some uniquely distinct abilities, but Tolkien clearly specified that all of them could only see events back in time. In the Rings of Power, the Palantiri is able to grant Galadriel and Miriel futuristic visions, which is in clear disagreement with what Tolkien had in mind. They'd better be going somewhere meaningful with this change, because otherwise it's just unnecessarily tampering with the works of a legend. Besides these major changes, there are lots of new introductions in the series. The Harfoots, for instance, are supposed to be the origin story for the Hobbits, and characters like Nori and the mysterious stranger, who might just be Gandalf, surely have a crucial storyline going ahead. In this video, we tried to bring you the major differences that we spotted because minor ones are plentiful. Do let us know in the comments below what you think about the changes and the new approach taken for the Rings of Power. And tell us which one of the changes above bothered you the most. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one, and be safe. Thanks, everyone.